Goeiedag en welkom hier by die jaarlikse Outeniqua inligtingsdag hier in George. Dit is 'n wonderlike fasiliteit hierdie navorsingsgeleenthede om inligting te deel met die produsente en ons landbouers. As gevolg van COVID-19 het ons besondere uitdagings en daarom het my navorsingsspan besluit om 'n virtuele Outeniqua inligtingsdag bekend te stel sodat ons landbounavorsingsresultate met die sektor kan deel. Die Wes-Kaapse Departement van Landbou beskik oor 7 navorsingsplase en deel van navorsing en ontwikkeling is een van die Wes-Kaapse Departement se strategiese prioriteite en dit is wonderlik om daardie navorsing op 'n jaarlikse inligtingsdag te deel. En hierdie geleentheid is weer eens van die jaar uniek omdat ons in COVID-19 hierdie aanbieding virtueel bring vir ons boere, ons landbouers, maar ook vir al die mense betrokke in hierdie sektor. Ek wens ook ons kollegas wat jaarliks die George Landbouskou aanbied, ook 'n suksesvolle beplanning ten opsigte van hulle werk. Hierdie navorsingsplaas is deel van die strategiese fokusareas om hoë kwaliteit melkproduksie hier te lewer, hoë vlakke van navorsing, die beskikbaring stelling van data wat omskep word in inligting. Daardie inligting word gedeel met ons melkbore sodat hulle strategiese beleidsbesluite kan neem en keuses kan neem om hulle winsproduksie vlakke op te skuif. Ek is baie trots op die kwaliteit van navorsing, die data en die inligting wat hier by die Outeniqua melkplaas gelewer word. Van dit word ingevoer in die insetkoste, in die beplanningkoste ten opsigte van ons boerderygemeenskap sodat ons ook hulle winsvlakke kan verhoog. Dit is van kritieke belang dat ons in die landbousektor moet staatmaak op navorsing, want dit verbeter ons landbouproduksie hier in die Wes-Kaap. Signing off for the love of agriculture.
Hi, my name is Sigrun Aman. I'm a pasture scientist with Western Cape Department of Agriculture at the Outeniqua Research Farm here at George. And for the information day, I'll share 2 talks with you. One on cultivar evaluation, looking at the most recent data for Italian and perennial ryegrass and also for chicory and plantain from 2018 up to February 2020. And the second talk will be about comparing tall fescue, perennial ryegrass, chicory and plantain with each other to try and see how these different species compare with each other and if they are competitive enough to be used in a dairy pasture system and how they contribute in the different seasons. So I will look at the best varieties that were in the cultivar trials and compare those with each other. I hope this data will add value to your farming systems and the choices you will make in buying new varieties for the coming season. Thank you.
Welcome to my talk on cultivar evaluation data for ryegrass, Italian and perennial, and for forage herbs from autumn 2018 up to summer 2019-20. For this presentation, we'll focus on certain parameters or data and why they are important, and the rest of the data is available in the booklet. Firstly, total yield or annual yield. For Italian ryegrass cultivars, we would expect them to last at least 12 months, and for perennial ryegrass and chicory and plantain, they should persist for greater than 12 months. The establishment and input costs are similar regardless of the performance of the variety, so it is important to choose the cultivar variety with the best potential. The total yield is also especially important if you're able to conserve the surplus as silage, because you might not be able to utilize everything as grazing. For the perennial species, the persistence into the second year and the yield stability over years is important, and then also which season is the most affected by a yield reduction in the second year. Secondly, seasonal yield. We need to optimize the fodder flow or fill gaps, and that's why seasonal yield is important. Is there a specific season that largely adds to the total yield, or is there a more even distribution for some of the cultivars over all the seasons? If there's a particularly high spring yield, for instance, that could be utilized for silage. We look for good winter and summer yield to provide sufficient grazing during the challenging seasons? Or are there even cultivars that provide both good winter and summer yield? And then, of course, the summer plus the second autumn are also important because those are often challenging times in terms of temperature and delays caused by oversowing. Next, we look at flowering behavior. Some Italian varieties flower quite prolifically, which would then affect the forage quality. Potentially, these could be used for silage during that time if one is okay with a lower quality silage. And then flowering behavior is particularly important for spring planting, which cultivars are suitable. And lastly, we will look at some rust data, and the rest of the data will be available in the booklet. Firstly, looking at total yield, Bellucci was the highest yielding with almost 15 tons dry matter per hectare, and then there were another 10 cultivars in the mid-blue color, or the stars marked at the bottom next to their name, that were similar to Bellucci in total yield. If we look at winter yield, chicory had the highest winter yield, or was most winter active, with 3.5 tons. Then there were another 8 cultivars that were similar to chicory in that mid-blue color. The stars indicate the cultivars that were highest or similar to highest in total yield. And we see that some of the cultivars are in this group of high winter yield, being Bond, Bellucci, and Yolandi. So those 5 were also good in total yield. Next, we look at summer yield, and there we see there's quite a wide range. Most of those varieties were statistically in the highest or similar yielding group. Again, we look at the ones with the stars having been the highest or similar total yield, and they all fall within that top group. We do see that Icon and Etazi were the highest yielding in summer, and those are different to what was highest yielding in winter. Next, we look at the flowering incidence or reproductive tillers. The darker the shading, the higher the flowering incidence, and the arrows on the left indicate the cultivars that were best yielding in total yield. And there were 2 cultivars amongst that group, being Maltra 2, the top, and chicory near the bottom here, that had a very high flowering incidence. The rest of them had a lower flowering incidence, which is more desirable. And what is important is that flowering is not necessarily linked to higher yield. Next, we look at sward density or persistence, and here again the arrows indicate those that were best in total yield. And we look specifically towards the right-hand side of the table, where we are in the summer months or towards the end of summer, what persisted right to the end of summer. And there were 3 varieties with the red arrows or the red circles here: Bellucci, Icon, and Scapino, that retained 100% sward density through to the end of summer. Then there were 2 varieties, being Etazi and Yolandi, that also retained a high sward density and were then still above 90% in February. And for the rest, there was quite a spread of sward density, with some losing quite a lot of density in the summer months. To summarize the Italian ryegrass, the winter and summer yield, the best cultivars were also the ones that were in the highest group for total yield. For winter yield, some of the best total yield cultivars were not in the best group for winter yield. The best winter yield was chicory, followed by Bond, Bellucci, Shogun, and Yolandi. Summer yield, the best cultivars were different to the winter yield group, and they were Icon and Etazi. but the best winter yield cultivars are also in the group of the highest yielding cultivars, and that was then Shogun, Bond, Bellucci, Yolandi, and Chicory. And here one would look to see which ones were then in those similar groups for winter and summer, and that would be Bond, Bellucci, Chicory, and Yolandi, and Shogun. Prolific flowering in summer, which would lead to lower forage quality. There were two, as mentioned, Balmaltra 2 and Chicory, again not directly linked to a higher yield. And then high yield plus low flowering incidence. We had Bellucci, Bond, Icon, Scapino, Shogun, and Yolandi. And high yield and high sword density through summer was Bellucci, Icon, Scapino, followed by Itazi and Yolandi. Next, we look at the flowering incidence linked to spring planting, because from a spring planting, we need to choose cultivars that have a very low flowering incidence, or preferably none. So we planted these out on the 14th of August and then assessed the flowering. And I've looked at what cultivars had less, or which cultivars had less than 5% flowering. And these are also ones that were doing well in the autumn yield trial. So Balmaltra 2 had 0% flowering, which is the top line. Bellucci had 4% flowering. And the next line, 140 days, indicates the time period from 14 August to 50% flowering. So it took 140 days to 4% flowering, and the last number indicates how long that flowering duration was, and that 4% flowered all within 1 week for Bellucci. Next, we go down to Icon, which had a very low incidence of just 2%, which was 154 days after planting, and also again it flowered all within 1 week. Itazi had 0, Scapino had 0, Udine had 4%, also low, but that took place over a 4-week period, and Yolandi also 4% over a 3-week period. So those would all be cultivars that would be suitable from a flowering point of view for spring planting. Next, we look at perennial ryegrass. Again, total yield, winter and summer yield, yield stability into the second year, and rust resistance. Looking at total yield, we had 150. This is in the first year, being the best in the first year, together with Fuster, Halo, Viscount, Tyson, and Governor being similar to it, so all between 13 and 14 tons dry matter. If we look at the second year, the top group was between 12 and 13 tons dry matter. The ones with the stars are the ones that had the highest or similar yield in the first year, and those are all in this top group of cultivars, but a whole lot of others have been added to it that actually then did well in the second year. If we look at the first and second year combined, we see, again, looking at the stars at the bottom and the names, that those 6 cultivars that were best in the first year are also best combined in the first 2 years. And then we still have Base, Billabong, and Trooper also in that group. If we look at where the yield loss took place from the first to the second year, basically the yield stability over years, we see that year 1 to year 2, the yield loss differed between varieties, and it was between 0 and 12% mostly. The top varieties, 150 and Fuster, lost 9% from year 1 to year 2, Halo 12, Viscount 4, Tyson 1, and Governor in fact had the same yield in year 1 and year 2 with a 0% reduction. And then there were some varieties that actually yielded better in the second year than they did in the first, and that was Base and Tanker, Billabong, and Lindor 2. So yes, quite a difference between the different varieties. Then which seasons lost most of the yield in the second year? And here we look at winter first compared to the second winter, and we see that there's anything between 25 and 53% reduction in yield depending on the cultivar. The top cultivars were between 30 and 40%, a difference between the first winter and the second winter. The next season that had the greatest loss was then summer, the first versus the second. And here there's quite a variation with base, here only losing 3%, whereas 150 lost 30% in the second summer. So very cultivar dependent. If we look at the rust, there is quite a difference. The darker the shading, the higher the rust percentage. If we look at which varieties had below 15% rust throughout the trial, then those were Fuster, Governor, Delica, and Sucrol that had a very low rust incidence. To summarize the perennial ryegrass, the total yield, year 1, the best ones were 150, Fuster, Halo, Viscount, Tyson, and Governor. In year 1 plus 2, Base, Billabong, and Trooper were added to that group. The winter yield, the second winter was between 25 and 50% lower than the first winter, depending on the cultivar. And the best first winter cultivars were Governor, Tyson, Viscount, 150, Nui, Trooper, Halo, Tanker, and Base. The summer yield, the second summer, the reduction was anything between 3 and 30% compared to the first year. Base lost 3%, 150 lost 30%. The yield stability into the second year, so the total yield was relatively stable with only 1 ton on average less than the first year, but the main losses were in winter and summer with a higher spring yield, so the yield distribution changed. The rust resistance was below 15% throughout the trial was Fuster, Governor, Delica, and Sucrol. Finally, we look at the forage herbs, chicory and plantain. Again, we look at the total yield and the various seasons, and then also the flowering distribution. Firstly, the chicory and plantain total yield of 17 months. So this is from establishment in October 2018 through to February 2020. And we see that 4 varieties were the highest yielding, being Agritonic with 32 tons, followed by Tonic, Captain, and a filler. A filler is a chicory. And then there were a whole lot of other varieties above 28 tons, which were similar to that highest yielding group. So quite a lot of the cultivars actually did really well in total yield over that period. If we look at the first year, again, most of the plantain and chicory cultivars did really well, and the ones that were at the bottom end were the ones that were winter dormant. So around 20 tons for the best cultivar in the first year. We look at the first summer more specifically. We see that Boston plantain was highest, and that was followed by all the other plantains and then some of the chicories as well. So generally a really good yield between 8 and 9 tons for many of the cultivars. If we look at the second summer, then Agritonic came out best, with Tonic and a filler being in the top 3. They were all the highest yielding, followed by most of the other cultivars being above 5.5 tons dry matter. So still mostly above 5.5 tons for the second summer. If we look at the percentage yield reduction, you can see that it is between 23% for tonic right up to 40% for something like Forage Feast. But what is important is that even though we have generally a 25 to 35% reduction, it still is at 6 tons dry matter generally in the second summer, which is still double that of ryegrass. Autumn is also an important period, and here again most of the cultivars actually produced were in that group of highest producing or similar, with only the more dormant cultivars at the bottom end here already starting to show some dormancy as the temperatures cool down. Winter was different, where we clearly see the separation into winter active and winter dormant, and the most winter active was tonic plantain, and similar to it was Captain plantain, followed by agritonic, and then most of the chicories were in the next group around 2.5 tons dry matter for winter. And then at the bottom end here there is Forage Feast, Hercules and Boston were extremely winter dormant. So 3 of the plantains were the most winter active, but also chicory having a fairly reasonable yield of 2.5 tons in the winter. Then if we look at the flowering, I've indicated flowering over the various harvests or the cuts as we go along. At the top of the table is the plantains, which is given as percentage plants flowering, and the bottom half of the table are the chicory cultivars, where the flowering incidence is given as plants per square meter. So in the first summer, 2 of the plantains did not flower, being Boston and Hercules, while agritonic, Captain and tonic flowered to varying degrees, up to a maximum of 50% for Captain. And the chicories all generally had some flowering, even though it was quite low, with the highest being 0.5 plants per square meter. Then as we continue through into the second year, we see that the flowering has increased quite a lot. Firstly, the flowering period is extended for both plantain and chicory. Plantain, it starts from October then through to January. The chicory also October, but that continues, even though it does decrease again in the cooler months. The plantain, Captain was slightly earlier than agritonic, and tonic. Boston did have a bit of flowering, and Hercules also started flowering in the second summer. Then for the chicory, there was a peak in flowering December, January, with between the highest, it was between 7 and 9 plants per square meter, depending on the cultivar. To summarize the chicory and plantain, they give very good summer and autumn yield from a spring establishment. Some cultivars also give winter yield comparable to the ryegrasses. Some cultivars are very winter dormant, which is undesirable, so that's something to watch out for. They are persistent into the second year, and flowering is more prolific in the second summer, which then needs to be managed with the grazing rotation. And finally, additional information and more detail will be available in the booklet. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me on this address.
I would like to show you some practical aspects to do with the different pasture species, and we'll start off with the plantain. What is very important is the plantain cultivars come in 2 different types. The one set of cultivars is very winter active, while the other set is very winter dormant. And that is obviously very important in the fodder flow, that we choose the winter active cultivars. The ones that are winter dormant are very active in summer, but then of course dormant in winter. So in this plot we can see quite nicely the difference between a winter active plantain, which now after a few weeks regrowth is at about 20 centimeters, whereas the winter dormant cultivar is 10 centimeters or less. And obviously that has very little forage, whereas this has quite a lot of forage on it, the winter active cultivar. What we also see is that the winter dormant ones, when they're in the dormant phase, they grow very flat. So they don't grow up tall, they grow very flat, and the leaves are very small, whereas the winter active cultivars, they grow very upright and they have the same leaf width or similar leaf width to what they would have in summer, quite broad leaves. So just a lot more forage there than there is here. For forage chicory, we have a similar situation as with the plantain. We have varieties that are more winter active and others that are more winter dormant. Of course, chicory is less winter active than plantain generally, but within the chicory varieties there is also a difference in winter activity. So here on my left is a more winter active variety, which you can see now stands at about 20 centimeters height, whereas the one on this side is a winter dormant variety, and the plants are less than 10 centimeters. They're fairly flat growing, not very big, and that also opens up the sward and allows weeds to get in. So not very much growth on the winter dormant variety, whereas on the winter active variety there's a lot more growth, even though it is less than would be the case on the plantain. So here we are in the tall fescue trial. This is the new tall fescue trial which was established in March this year. And the trial has cultivars ranging from continental types to Mediterranean types. The continental types are generally summer active, or they can be active from spring through summer into autumn, whereas the Mediterranean types are purely winter active. Some of the varieties can overlap a little bit from autumn through to the beginning of spring. So the one I'm standing in is a very winter dormant continental variety, and it hasn't accumulated much leaf growth in the last 6 weeks. This is 6 weeks growth, whereas on this side we have a Mediterranean variety which is extremely winter active and is around 40 centimeters height right now. So this is the growth it accumulated in 6 weeks. The slight problem though for dairy pastures is that even though there's a lot of material here, it has quite a high fiber content. So these Mediterranean types are more suitable for beef pastures or in a combination or mixed pasture where there are other highly palatable components. There are, however, also continental types that show some winter activity, and we can look at some of those now. So here we have continental types. In the middle here we have a very dormant continental cultivar, which or winter dormant continental cultivar. On the right here we have also a continental cultivar, but it does have some winter activity. So you can see this is quite a bit taller than that one. So this would be a very suitable cultivar because it has both summer activity and a fair amount of winter growth. And if we go to this side, here is another continental cultivar that actually does have quite a lot of winter growth. One can see a bit of variability, which does happen. It's obviously this growth is sort of out of its season, but it has quite a lot of winter growth that's accumulated. So this again would be a very suitable cultivar to choose, because it would have a more constant fodder flow throughout the year and not this production only in the warmer months of the year and nothing in the cooler months. So we're looking for varieties that have a sustained production throughout the year. And the more modern continental tall fescue types, there are varieties that can actually do that, where they do show some winter growth activity. So this is a tall fescue trial again, containing Mediterranean and continental cultivars. This trial in fact is 3.5 years old, and the plot I'm standing in is a typically winter dormant continental cultivar, which does not accumulate much growth in winter. You can see it's got a very dense sward, so there's nothing wrong with the persistence or the plant density, but it's just not very actively growing in the winter months. Whereas on the right hand side here we have a Mediterranean cultivar, which is very winter active. So this has accumulated about 30 centimeters of growth. Again, the hassle is it is quite fibrous, so probably the forage quality is not so great for a dairy cow, and in fact it's starting to flower, so these plants are going reproductive, which would still increase the fiber content even more. But amongst the continental types there are of course also those that are winter active. So if we look here, this is a winter active continental type, so it's not quite as active as a Mediterranean type, but much better than a very dormant type, and there is some yield accumulation here. Again, very dense sward, although this particular variety has quite coarse leaves and quite open tufts, so it makes it very suitable in combination with other species in a mixed pasture. So it allows some light into the canopy, and if this is combined with, for instance, plantain or red clover, the structure of this sward is suitable for a mixed pasture. So there are continental types that are suitable for such intensive systems that need a more even fodder flow throughout the year, and that is why it's very important to choose the tall fescue cultivar very carefully to make sure it fits the need of the fodder flow throughout the year. So this particular plot is a so-called festilolium cultivar, which is a cross between a tall fescue and a lolium. And if we compare the sward density of the pure tall fescue cultivars in this trial, we see they're very dense, to this, which is the festilolium. After 3.5 years, we do have some open spaces, so the persistence is not quite there. So there's opening up of the sward, and we start getting weed ingression into the open spaces. The advantage of the festilolium is that this particular one is that it does have some winter growth on it, but it does not grow as actively in summer as the pure tall or the best pure tall fescues do. The forage quality of this would be better than, for instance, the tall fescues, so less fiber, but obviously the persistence is not quite the same as would be the case with a pure tall fescue variety.
Welcome to my talk on comparing the production potential of perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, chicory and plantain. The focus here is on dairy pastures and to see if tall fescue, chicory and plantain are suitable for intensive dairy production. The challenges, or most recent challenges, for intensive dairy pasture farming are drought, irrigation water availability, which is linked to drought but also to increased human and industrial needs, costs such as annual establishment, and efficiency such as water use efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency. So which characteristics could assist to overcome these challenges? For instance, the perenniality of plants, if they are deep-rooted to access more water and be more robust, highly productive, if they have a stable yielding capacity over years, and have sufficient forage quality for dairy production. And then one would also want to focus on increased diversity, either on paddock or on farm scale, to increase robustness. So the temperate species that are commonly used for intensive dairy pasture production are the low-limb species, which are Italian hybrid and perennial ryegrass. The possible alternative species are tall fescue, narrow-leaf plantain, and forage chicory. And I will compare yield and forage quality data of these alternative species to perennial ryegrass from cultivar evaluation trials that were done at Outeniqua Research Farm for the time period autumn 2017 to summer 2019-20. Firstly, looking at the yield, the annual yield of year 1 on a species level, which is the mean of all the cultivars in the trial, we see that the tall fescue yields similar to the perennial ryegrass, while the forage herbs have a significantly higher yield. If we look at year 2, we see the same pattern where tall fescue and perennial ryegrass have a similar yield and the forage herbs have a higher yield, even though all 3 of them have a lower yield than in the first year. In the third year, the pattern looks different, where they all have a lower yield and all 3 species have a similar yield. If we look more specifically at the best cultivars within each species, so we have the cultivar Spada, chicory, tonic plantain, governor perennial ryegrass, and eastern tall fescue. And in the first year, we can see that the tall fescue cultivar eastern yields similar to the perennial ryegrass cultivar governor, while the forage herbs, chicory and plantain, yield significantly higher than the grasses. And what is important is that the plantain yields significantly higher than chicory and all the rest of the forage herbs in the trial. In the second year, we see that the best varieties of the grass species, the eastern, is better than all the other varieties in the trial, and the governor similarly is better than all the other varieties in the perennial ryegrass trial. In terms of the chicory Spada, the second year yield is similar to all the other varieties in the trial, while plantain is significantly higher yielding. In the third year, again, the tonic plantain outyields all the other varieties or cultivars, and we see that the chicory Spada has a similar yield to the eastern tall fescue and the perennial ryegrass cultivar governor. If we look at the cumulative yield of the first 2 years for these 4 different cultivars, we see that the grasses, the best varieties being eastern and governor perennial ryegrass, yield significantly higher than all the other cultivars in the trial. The chicory Spada is similar to all the other varieties, while again tonic plantain is significantly higher yielding. The important thing is the difference between the tall fescue and perennial ryegrass and the tonic being about 17 tons dry matter, which equates to a 50% higher yield of tonic plantain over the grasses. And this is a really significant amount of dry matter yield. Looking at winter yield, we see that eastern tall fescue, the first set of bars over 3 years, has a really good yield in the first year, but then drops off significantly in the second and third year, being winter dormant. The governor perennial ryegrass, the second set of bars, drops off steadily over the 3 years, while the tonic plantain and spada chicory have a higher yield in the second winter compared to the first winter, and then a lower yield in the third winter. If we look at summer, here we see that eastern tall fescue on the left and spada chicory on the far right have a very stable yield in the first 2 summers with a reduction in the third summer, while governor perennial ryegrass and tonic plantain have a steady decline over the 3 summer periods. Very similar pattern, however, the tonic plantain yields at a much higher level, so the decrease over the 3 years results in the third year with its lowest yield still being as high as perennial ryegrass in its first year. If we look briefly at the forage quality, and here we will only look at NDF and we will look at winter and summer, it is quite clear that the first 3 bars are the grasses, and then we have the forage herbs, that the grasses have the higher NDF, but the NDF of the eastern tall fescue is actually lower in the first year than it is for the perennial ryegrass, but then it is higher in the second year, which is the second green bar, while the forage herbs have a relatively low NDF, but it is still sufficiently high for dairy production requirements. In fact, it is at just above the minimum or at the minimum requirement. In summer, the NDF of all the 4 different varieties is higher than it is in winter, with eastern tall fescue being the highest. The forage herbs are also higher than they are in winter, although all of these are still within the range of what would be regarded as suitable for dairy production, especially in combination with other species. Finally, to conclude, do the alternative species, tall fescue, forage chicory, and plantain, match up to perennial ryegrass according to the 3 questions we asked in the beginning? So are they highly productive? Yes, they are. Their seasonal yield distributions differ though. Do they have a stable yielding capacity over years? Yes, they do. And they can be grown for 2 years without oversowing being required or reinforcement being required. Is the forage quality suitable for dairy? Yes, it is. So this data shows that the alternative species, which also are deeper rooted and are more perennial than perennial ryegrass, have the potential to be used for highly productive dairy pasture systems. There are just a few pointers that we need to consider for these species to be successful. Firstly, the establishment phase is very important, and here we need to look at soil temperature. So for tall fescue to have rapid establishment, the soil temperature should be consistently above 15 degrees. So that means that it actually needs to be established in early autumn rather than late autumn. Chicory, it would be best above 12 degrees, and plantain 10 to 12 degrees. So soil temperature, very important. Then the next very important aspect is the time duration from establishment to first grazing. So for tall fescue, the plants just need to be firmly rooted and no pulling. For chicory and plantain, the leaf stage is important. So chicory needs to have 7 full leaves before the first grazing, and plantain 6 to 7 full leaves. This, from a spring planting, this normally translates into about 6 weeks or so. But this is a very important aspect in determining the future success of such a pasture. After that, chicory and plantain can be grazed at pretty much any leaf stage that is reasonable, and mostly is grazed rather on height. And if we do look at grazing management, we are used to the strict 3-leaf stage or canopy closure with perennial ryegrass, but with these species, they are generally more flexible. So tall fescue is a 4-leaf plant, but the maximum growth rate is actually at 2.5 leaf, as has been researched by Chapman. And for chicory, it can be grazed subsequently to the first grazing. It can be grazed at 25 to 30 centimeter height, and plantain 20 to 25 centimeter height. Both should not have a rotation that is too long, especially in summer, to prevent too many flowering stems from emerging. The forage herbs should generally not be grazed lower than 4 centimeters to ensure the plants are not weakened or that yield stability is assured. And yes, so forage herbs, the leaf stage is not as important except for the first grazing. Next, these species can be used either in monocultures or mixtures. So as monocultures, they would be grown in separate fields but grazed alternately to create a mixed diet, or they could be planted in a mixed pasture, and then various aspects have to be considered. The first is plant morphology or structure, to try and create a mixture that allows for all its components to intercept light and not be outcompeted, but to be productive within the mixture with having access to sufficient resources, especially light. The competition effects during establishment need to be considered, and this is mostly a problem if ryegrass is included in the establishment phase. It can be very dominant or competitive compared to the other components. At the same time, tall fescue is not very competitive compared to the herbs, and one just needs to understand the different competition effects. So seasonal yield of the different components are important to try and make sure one ends up with a pasture that has a sort of consistent fodder flow and not a huge gap anywhere. Then the grazing cycles are important based on, one needs to decide on which species it is based, or the grazing cycle needs to be based on the species that is most important in the mixture, and then which species to manage for, which links to the grazing cycle, but which would also link to, for instance, if there is lucerne in the mixture, one would need to consider aspects such as bloating and flowering and such things. Then lastly, mixtures are dynamic, which means the botanical composition does change over time, and various components may have to be added to the mixture as one goes along. So these are just some of the aspects to consider, and the farm systems research will provide more insight into this, so I encourage you to listen to Janke's presentation on monocultures and mixtures used under grazing. If you have any questions, you are very welcome to email me on this address. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Janke van der Kolf. I'm a pasture scientist based here on Outeniqua Research Farm. I work within the Directorate Plant Sciences for the Western Cape Department of Agriculture, and my research focuses on the development of systems for pasture-based dairy production. Currently we are undertaking a system trial based on a farmlet approach, looking at how we can integrate and manage forage herbs within our pasture systems. This system study is based on a farmlet approach, so we have 4 5-hectare farmlets, each allocated a different pasture system, on which we also manage a mini herd of approximately 30 cows. The pasture systems all contain either a forage herb or a mixture, and then one system has the chicory ryegrass system, which is traditional for the area. So I hope you enjoy my talk and some of the preliminary results for this trial.
Greetings, and thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation that is going to look at preliminary results for farmlet research aimed at the inclusion of forage herbs in pasture systems. So I think we can all agree that there are a myriad of challenges involved in producing milk from intensively cultivated pastures. For example, an increasing pressure on irrigation water supplies due to intermittent droughts and increased competition from other industries for these resources, while producers also have to focus on maximizing other efficiency parameters such as nutrient use efficiency due to higher input costs and concerns over environmental contamination. Poor persistence and the related high pasture establishment costs, often compounded by high weed loads in no-till pastures, have also become a major concern, while producers are increasingly being pressurized to give more careful consideration to natural resources such as soil and even the overall health of ecosystems on their farms. All of this while taking into consideration the demands placed on them by an increasingly knowledgeable consumer. With this in mind, a system trial is underway on the Outeniqua research farm to investigate how to best integrate alternative pasture species such as plantain and tall fescue into pasture systems in order to increase overall productivity and efficiency while minimizing risk for the producers. With systems evaluated by applying a multidisciplinary approach on a large enough scale and based on real farm practices in order to ensure relevance to the industry. On this premise, the study is based on a farmlet approach, with 3 farmlets allocated an area of 5.5 hectares each on the Outeniqua research farm, assigned one of 3 pasture systems, and then managed as closed and independent farming systems. System 1 is a traditional chicory ryegrass system, with an established chicory base, into which ryegrass was planted during autumn using a no-till planter. In the second system, the chicory was sprayed off and a mixture consisting of red clover, tall fescue and plantain was no-till planted in March 2019. While the third and last system consists of 80% of the area planted to tall fescue in autumn after the existing pasture had been sprayed off, with the remaining 20% of the farmlet allocated to plantain established the previous spring. In this system, the intake of each component is based on the proportional yield of it within the farmlet at any specific time. Each system has also been allocated its own mini herd of 20 cows in milk and 5 dry animals, with the objective to mimic a typical pasture-based herd managed to calve throughout the year. Animals were thus selected to maintain an even distribution of lactation number and days in milk at approximately 150. This will result in a constant flow of animals into and out of the systems as they calve or are dried up. Concentrate is applied at a relatively low rate of 4 kilograms of concentrate per day per cow, which is fed during milking twice a day, with fresh pasture also allocated twice a day based on pasture yield and the intake requirements of the mini herd.
During the study, which will run over a number of years, data on multiple parameters will obviously be collected. However, for the purpose of this presentation, the preliminary data for year 1 was normalized to construct index values as per Scott et al. The pasture index consisted of pasture yield and also the contribution of the sown component to botanical composition. A fodder flow index was also constructed as the systems were viewed as closed and self-sustaining. This index then included the grazing capacity, as well as the proportion of cow days on pasture versus bales during periods when pasture demand was higher than what could be supplied by the pasture. During periods when pasture supply exceeded demand, it then included the proportion of the platform that could be cut for silage, as well as the number of bales cut on this area. Then lastly, during periods when pasture was being renovated or oversown, the index also included the proportion of the area that was sacrificed for establishment and could thus not be grazed by animals. Lastly, the milk index contained data pertaining to the milk yield and also the milk components.
So how does one then normalize data? Well, if one has a desirable trait such as pasture yield, you would take the highest value, in this case, for example, in October for the mixture, and then divide the other two values by that specific value. And that would then give you your normalized data as follows. For the purpose of this presentation, these values were then summed within a particular season to obtain a seasonal index value for a particular component. These respective components, in this case pasture, fodder flow and milk index values, were then also summed within a season to obtain a total seasonal index value. So the seasonal index values then give us a nice snapshot of how the systems performed compared to each other. For example, during the first winter, the mixture system had the overall highest index value. However, it is important that we try and look at a breakdown to discover in terms of what specific parameters the system did well. So a breakdown of the seasonal index value will then look as follows. In this breakdown, you will then see that the green bars represent our pasture index values, namely pasture yield and the sown component contribution. The grey bars represent our fodder flow index values, and the red bars are milk index values. So the primary driver of a high winter index value was the high pasture index components, both yield and botanical composition, as achieved by the mixture. Of particular interest was the higher fodder flow index components for the monoculture system. Although the reason for the higher grazing capacity achieved by the system is not yet clear, it is hypothesized that higher rates of intake, stimulated by the movement of animals from plantain to fescue mid-morning, could have been a contributing factor. Lastly, although the milk yield index was higher on the ryegrass system, this system performed poorly in terms of yield and grazing capacity, which negatively impacted its overall index value. As we move on to spring, we see that the highest index value was again achieved by the mixture system. And as can be seen from the index breakdown, this is because the mixture system had the highest index value for all parameters with the exception of the milk components. In other words, it had a high index value for pasture yield and sown components, as well as a high fodder flow index, which is indicative of its potential to support more animals while also allowing more fodder to be conserved in the form of cut silage during spring. And although not excessively high, the milk yield index was also higher for the mixture system than the other two systems during spring.
During summer, however, for the first time, the index is now highest for the ryegrass system. And once one looks at the index breakdown, it is apparent that during summer, the fodder flow dynamics of the three systems start to become more complicated and have a larger impact on the overall performance of each system. This is because during summer, silage was still being cut, but areas earmarked for extreme renovation were already being sprayed off and as such not available for grazing. So in terms of the pasture index, the mixture still outperforms the other two systems, while the ryegrass system notably has a lower sown component index than the other two, indicating that it's more prone to weed ingression. So what happens in terms of fodder flow? Well, the mixture maintains a high grazing capacity index and is also the only system where none of the platform had to be sacrificed for re-establishment or renovation. On the ryegrass system, 20% of the platform was identified as severely degraded due to weed ingression and sprayed off. On the monoculture system, a decision was made to convert an additional 25% of the fescue to plantain. However, in terms of conservation, or the area cut and baled, the ryegrass system had the highest index values. This is expected from the system, where high pasture accumulation in the summer does allow for silage to be cut, but the quality of the silage may be questionable and needs to be further investigated. As in spring, the milk yield index was highest for the mixture system. During autumn, however, we see that the highest seasonal index is then again achieved by the mixture system. By autumn, fodder flow dynamics shift again, as pastures were being oversown and pasture shortages had to be supplemented with conserved forage. Much as in spring and summer, the mixture remains the system with the most favorable pasture index, while it is lowest for the Kikuyu ryegrass system. Of interest is the high Kikuyu ryegrass system grazing capacity index, but at the same time the lowest cow days supported by pasture index. The reason behind this is that the grazing cycle had to be slowed down to accommodate the time required for the oversown ryegrass to establish on this platform. In contrast, the re-establishment index is highest for the mixture, since the entire platform could be grazed as no re-establishment had to occur. The lower requirement for conserved forage on the monoculture system was primarily due to the high yield obtained from the newly established plantain component on this platform. As in spring and summer, the mixture had the highest milk yield in autumn. When the seasonal index values are totaled within the year, it becomes apparent that the mixture system had the highest index value, both overall but also for the components pasture, fodder flow, and milk yield.
So although the index values give us a really good way to compare the systems relative to each other, I still hear you ask, what is the actual yielding ability of the different systems? Well, in terms of total annual pasture yield, we see that the Kikuyu ryegrass system yielded approximately 14 tons of dry matter per hectare, the monoculture system almost 16 tons of dry matter per hectare, and the mixture system 18 tons of dry matter per hectare. In terms of total annual milk yield in kilograms milk produced per hectare per annum, we see that the monoculture system had the ability to yield 2,708 kilograms milk more than the Kikuyu ryegrass system, whilst the mixture system yielded 4,466 kilograms more milk per hectare than the traditional Kikuyu ryegrass system. These values thus clearly indicate that including plantain, whether in a monoculture or in a mixture, definitely has the ability to both increase pasture and milk yield. So what is the way forward? Well, although these preliminary indexes can indicate how systems are currently performing comparatively over seasons at this early stage in the project, it is imperative that we look at the potential of creating a weighted index based on a broader range of parameters, including forage quality, water use efficiency, nutrient use efficiency, and even an ecological index, and evaluated over multiple years in order to get a more accurate representation of how systems will actually perform over time. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation and also invite you to contact me if you have any further questions or queries.
So this presentation is going to focus a little bit more on the practical lessons we've learned from the Farmlet research conducted on Outeniqua. So when doing a Farmlet study, we are basically farming just on a very small scale, which means that we get a better idea of how multiple aspects such as soil, plant, and animal will interact, while also exposing us to everyday and sometimes even unknown challenges experienced by producers, like, for example, how do systems react when irrigation water runs out during the growth season? Or how does one manage fodder flow on a whole farm basis when the area and the number of animals remains constant? But of course, we are also conducting research, just on a much larger scale than is often the norm and within intensively managed pasture-based dairy systems. This means we are on a daily basis measuring, observing, managing, and adjusting our approach where necessary. So the first steep learning curve was to observe how big of a problem weeds have really become in our no-till Kikuyu ryegrass pastures. And I believe this is partially due to what I like to refer to as weed blindness. For example, all three of these photos were taken in one paddock that is supposed to be a Kikuyu ryegrass pasture in late winter. And if asked which one is the most weed infested, most of us would say A. However, when outlining the area taken up by weeds, in this case curly dock, bromus, and Eragrostis plana, it becomes apparent that the grasses can be just as problematic as broadleaf weeds, as we see that each is actually contributing almost the same proportion cover on the area photographed, with the problem being that these volunteer grasses are often of low forage quality
and compete for important natural resources such as nutrients and water, not even mentioning the potential allelopathic effects they can have on the pasture species surrounding them. The good news is that there is hope, because during the system trial we have converted this severely degraded paspalum pasture into both plantain and fescue. But on Outeniqua, we have also seen that the key to successful establishment is to evaluate your pasture, plan the right intervention, and commit. For example, both these plantain pastures were established in the autumn of 2020, but pasture 2 had a notable stinging nettle problem prior to being grazed for the first time. And the primary difference between these two pastures is in how they were established. So pasture 1 was sprayed with glufosinate in mid-Jan, then mulched to ground level to remove above ground material and facilitate its breakdown. In mid-Feb, it was again sprayed, but this time MCPA was included to target specifically stinging nettle and cape weed, after which the plantain was planted in early March. However, in pasture 2, it was only sprayed once using a contact herbicide, then mulched shortly afterwards, and planted at the end of March. This thus highlights the need to both sufficiently control weeds before establishment, but also the likely importance of planting early enough for these species such as plantain. One of the harder lessons to learn during the Farmlet study was even our best efforts can fail due to long-term impacts of poor management. For example, a specific area on the chicory ryegrass pasture was characterized as degraded, since more than 50% of the sward was attributed to typal, particularly on the back areas of the paddock. It was thus decided to kill off this existing sward and plant perennial ryegrass, with a specific focus on trying to reduce allelopathic effects of typal on establishment. This then involved grazing the area as short as possible in January and spraying it with a selective grass herbicide the next week, followed by a second herbicide treatment with glufosinate and MCPA a month later. 2 weeks after this, the area was then mulched to ground level and irrigated in an attempt to wash out any allelopathic chemicals, keeping in mind that almost 200 millimeters of rain had fallen during Jan and Feb prior to establishment. The ryegrass was then planted within a day after the soil was determined to be dry enough. After all of that, how successful was our establishment? Well, in the front of the strips, we had a good strike rate and what I would deem a good establishment. While in contrast, on the back third of the strip, where there was a greater proportion of typal, and you could actually still see some of that typal material 6 weeks later, establishment and strike rate was appreciably poorer. This was also reflected in the yield at first grazing, with the back third of the strip actually having a yield only 35% that of what we achieved in the front. This thus clearly illustrates the impact that a previous sward can have on the establishment success of the current sward, and the importance of managing weeds, particularly allelopathic weeds, to avoid them from becoming such a major problem and obstacle. But even on our chicory pastures that aren't degraded, there may be other factors affecting our establishment success. For example, these 2 adjacent paddocks were planted on the same day in early March with the same ryegrass variety and using the same planter. However, this paddock was simply grazed short, mulched to ground level, and then planted with a no-till planter, while this paddock was sprayed off a month before planting. And as can be seen just before they were grazed, the paddock on the left appears notably shorter and even slightly nutrient deficient, while the yield of the strip on the left was also lower than that on the right at the first grazing. This phenomenon definitely warrants more investigation, as we may be getting relatively poorer establishment success from our oversown pastures than we are currently aware of. So, a last few notes on the establishment of forage herbs specifically, and to a degree all pasture species. And the first is that we have successfully established forage herbs using minimum till methods. But the key is to ensure that competition is limited as far as possible, so preferably by spraying off the existing sward. And then making certain that planting depth is very shallow, but still obtaining good seed-soil contact. Or else your germination and emergence may be slow and lowered, resulting in poor and patchy establishment as can be seen in this picture. Species like tall fescue often get a bad rap because producers are under the impression that they're slow to establish,
poor competitors, and thus you get a poor sward. However, what these farmlet studies have highlighted is that we should not blame the species or even the variety for our poor planning. And with species like tall fescue and plantain, an early planting date can be particularly important. For example, on our monoculture fescue pasture, we ensured that we went in early in March into a sprayed-off area and planted the fescue. At only 6 days after planting, we already had seedlings emerging, and at 10 days after planting, we had relatively strong, robust seedlings. Unfortunately, I do not have pictures of the sward during the winter, but I do have a photo of the sward 18 months after establishment, clearly showing a well-established and persistent fescue sward. So moving on from pasture establishment, the next big learning point on the farmlets was that weekly farm walks were invaluable in managing fodder flow, particularly for pastures containing both plantain and fescue, as these species appear to react much more rapidly to changing abiotic circumstances such as soil moisture or temperature. For example, pasture accumulation on the fescue and the plantain increased much more rapidly following a good rainfall event after a dry spell than it did on the chicory ryegrass. On a similar note, daily measurements for the determination of pasture yield and for allocation purposes also highlighted some interesting points. The most important of which is that allocation is not a one-size-fits-all management factor. Even with access to specifically developed and relatively good calibration equations, pasture allocation should involve some tweaking, with adjustments generally based on visual assessments of animals during grazing and by scrutinizing your post-grazing height or residue. So if I have talked you to sleep with my soothing voice up until now, I need you to quickly perk up, because this is probably the most important lesson that I've learned from the farmlets, and that is that mixtures are extremely complex in terms of botanical composition and the changes thereof over time. So in May 2019, just before grazing the plantain red clover fescue mix for the first time, it consisted mainly of plantain, but also had a significant proportion of fescue and some clover, with the composition remaining relatively stable into August and also into early spring during September. However, by middle summer in January, the fescue component was now much lower, and the red clover component actually made a notable contribution. So based on the favorable botanical composition, the good cover, and the fact that the mixture was still yielding really well at the end of summer 2020, the decision was made to not oversow it during the autumn. After making this decision, we then, much like you, waited with bated breath to see what would happen with our mixture in the winter of year 2. So to give you a little bit of background, the mixture was actually cross-planted in March of 2019 to achieve optimum seeding depth for the different pasture species. But because of sprinkler placements within the pasture strips, small strips were actually not planted to the whole mixture and only received the fescue component. The reason I'm showing you this photo is because it was actually taken in August 2020, clearly indicating that the fescue component in itself was able to establish and persist under the management imposed on this area, if there was no competition from the other components. However, when you look at the corresponding composition of the pasture mixture on a whole during August 2020, it is apparent that the plantain has now become the major component by the winter of year 2, with a relatively small contribution made by the fescue and the red clover. And this, alongside a relatively low grazing capacity maintained in winter of year 2, has raised some serious questions regarding the mixtures. For example, what grass should we include in our mixtures? Are there alternatives to fescue that may better match our requirements? Should we maybe first establish the broadleaf mix and then plant the grass into it at a later stage? Maybe after year 1 or year 2? Or should we still establish the whole mixture and then simply oversow it with the grass during the autumn of year 1 to improve the yield during winter of year 2? Then lastly, will this mixture always react in this manner? In other words, how does management or the particular conditions within a season affect the changes in botanical composition? These are all answers that only time can answer and further investigations. And lastly, I would like to make one short comment on the point of drought tolerance and what I observed during the Farmlet study. My observations have very much aligned with what is said in the literature, in that ryegrass did not fare well when water became limited. While although the fescue and plantain were not drought resistant, in that plants definitely became more dormant and appeared stunted during dry conditions, they did show improved resilience in that they could rapidly recover once moisture became more available, clearly highlighting that they can definitely play a role in systems where irrigation water has become one of our most limiting factors. So on the point of farmlet studies and farming as a whole, I would like to close off with the words from Thomas McKenna that state, "Chaos is roving through the system and able to undo at any point the best laid plans." Happy farming, everyone. And thank you for listening to this presentation.
Hi, I'm Robin Mieska, Specialist Scientist at Outeniqua Research Farm, and we are here today for our Information Day, and this year it's a bit different, so it's because it's a virtual day. But I would like to introduce you to Zander Pretorius. He's from the University of Pretoria, and he has done some very interesting work on how to supplement cows that graze on plantain and ryegrass. And we're looking forward to your presentation. Tell us a bit more about it.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a MSc student at the University of Pretoria. I did some research on plantain here at the Outeniqua Experimental Farm. My study, I tested different levels of concentrate feed and what effect this will have on the rumen parameters and production parameters on Jersey cows, grazing ryegrass and plantain. Today we will be looking at different levels of starch within a dairy concentrate as supplemented to Jersey cows grazing plantain and ryegrass pastures. What effect will this have on the rumen and production parameters? I did the study under the supervision of Professor Robin Mieska and Professor Lawrence Erasmus. Plantain is a perennial forage herb with higher milk production potential than ryegrass. It is very palatable with a high mineral profile. It also has a very deep rooting system which makes it more tolerant to drought. The problem with plantain is its insufficient fiber content. Buffering capacity within the rumen is subpar, leading to lower rumen pH, and this compromises rumen health. Acetate production is also decreased, which can lead to milk fat depression. Cows in a pasture-based system normally receive 5 to 8 kilograms of dairy concentrate per cow per day. These concentrates normally contain 50 to 80% maize. Maize can alternatively be replaced with high fiber byproducts, which will increase the fiber content of the concentrates and improve rumen health. The aim of my study was to determine the effect that low, medium and high starch concentrates will have on the production and rumen parameters of Jersey cows grazing plantain and ryegrass pastures. The trial commenced on 12 September of 2019 and it ended on 30 October. 9 hectares of ryegrass was planted at 20 kilograms per hectare and 5 hectares of plantain was planted at 9 kilograms per hectare in April of 2019. The pastures were under permanent irrigation. And after each grazing, 42 kilograms of nitrogen was fertilized using a limestone ammonium nitrate, which contains 28% nitrogen. A rising plate meter was used to allocate pasture and to determine pasture yield. As you can see here, 3 treatments were used during the trial. The one was a high starch concentrate which contains 80% maize. We had the medium concentrate, 50% maize, and a low concentrate, 20% maize. Here we can see the ingredient composition of the 3 treatments clearly shows maize being replaced by the high fiber byproducts, Harmony Chop, wheat bran, soya hulls, and soybean wool cake. The rest of the ingredients stayed constant between treatments. For the production study, 51 multiparous Jersey cows were divided into 3 groups with 17 blocks. Cows were blocked according to average milk yield, days in milk, and lactation number. The groups were then randomly allocated to the three treatments. Each cow received 3 kilograms of concentrate during the morning milking and 3 kilograms during afternoon milking, giving a total of 6 kilograms per cow per day. Pasture was allocated at 12 kilograms per day to ensure that intake was not limited. The milk yield for each cow was recorded twice a day. Composite milk samples were taken every second week for a total of 3 samples. These samples were analyzed for milk component yield. Body weight and body condition score was taken at the beginning and at the end of the trial. Average values over 2 consecutive days were used for body weight, and body condition score was done by the same technician. Pasture samples were taken twice a week for both plantain and ryegrass. The samples were dried at 60 degrees Celsius for 72 hours to determine the dry matter. They were then pulled together for every week. Samples to develop pasture regression equations were taken once a week. If we look at the chemical composition of the concentrate treatments, a clear increase in NDF from high to low starch treatments is observed. Plantain has a lower dry matter content compared to ryegrass, and we can see that the NDF value of plantain is extremely low. Energy values between concentrate treatments are equal, but they differ between ryegrass and plantain, with ryegrass having the higher value. The mineral content of plantain is 57 grams per kilogram higher than ryegrass, with calcium being almost 4 times higher in plantain compared to ryegrass. Mineral values are higher in the low starch treatment group because of higher inclusions of high fiber byproducts. Magnesium, sodium, copper, iron, and zinc values are higher in plantain than ryegrass. This graph and the following graph indicates yield at a given rising plate meter height. Regression equations were developed over the course of the trial, and they are indicated here on the graphs. This one is perennial ryegrass's regression, and here we have plantain's regression. As I previously mentioned, the rising plate meter was used for pasture allocation and yield determination. For ryegrass, pre-grazing yields needs to stay within a rising plate meter reading of 20 to 25, and post-grazing yield should have a rising plate meter reading of around 10 to 12. Plantain's pre- and post-grazing heights are not well defined. For this trial, the grazing commenced just above a rising plate meter of 25, but the cows tended to graze it to very low post-grazing heights. This table indicates the milk production parameters. The milk yield tended to differ between the high starch and medium starch treatments, as well as for the low starch and medium starch treatments. This means that the medium starch treatment containing 50% maize outcompeted the other 2 treatments. The same trends can be seen in fat-corrected milk, and this is because the milk fat had no significant difference between treatments. Milk protein and milk lactose showed no significant differences between the treatments, and the milk urine nitrogen levels show that protein intake was not a limiting factor. No significant differences in live weight change or body condition change was found between the different treatments. The rumen study only included the high starch and the low starch treatments. Rumen pH was measured using the true test pH loggers. The loggers were inserted into the rumen through the rumen cannula, and it took pH readings for every 10 minutes for 2 days. No differences were found between the 2 treatments. I also took handheld pH meter readings during the rumen sampling process and also found no significant differences between the treatments. This graph indicates the trends of rumen pH over a 24-hour period. The high starch and the low starch treatments showed similar trends. The pH increased as the concentrate treatments were leaving the cow's system. At 6 a.m., when they received their concentrate, the rumen pH declined until 11 a.m., after which it increased until 1 o'clock, where they once again received their concentrate treatments. Thus, receiving concentrate treatments lowers the rumen pH. Analysis of rumen fluids showed a slight difference between the high starch and the low starch treatments, with the low starch producing a little bit more volatile fatty acids. However, the rumen ammonia content between the treatments were the same. The economical implications of an extra liter of milk produced when changing from the high starch to the medium starch treatment is worth mentioning. We can assume the same milk price for all the treatments because of constant milk solid production. If the milk price is R5.50 per litre and you have a 400 cow unit, your profit can increase up to R2,200 per day, which amounts to R66,000 extra income per month. To conclude, if the maize content of a dairy concentrate is decreased by replacing it with high fiber byproducts from 80 to 50%, it tends to increase the milk production with no differences in milk content. If maize content is decreased from 80 to 20%, no differences in milk yield or component yield is observed. A situation where maize is very expensive, considering high fiber byproducts potentially increases your profit margins. Thank you very much for indulging me. I really hope you enjoyed my presentation.
I would like to introduce another speaker for our information day. His name is Benry van Grenen. Benry has done some very interesting research on essential oils, and he's going to tell us a bit more about what his study was about.
Hi everyone, I'm an MSc student from the University of Stellenbosch. I conducted my trial at the Outeniqua Research Farm on essential oils. We tested the effect of essential oils on the milk production and the milk composition in the rumen environment, on Jersey cows grazing ryegrass pasture in the springtime.
I will be talking about essential oils as a possible feed additive for Jersey cows grazing ryegrass pasture in the springtime. My supervisors are Professor Robin Meeske, Dr. Brink van Zyl, and Professor Christian Kruiwagen. Introduction and problem identification. Feed additives are feed ingredients that may cause a wanted animal response in a non-nutrient role. Feed additives are regularly included when concentrates are formulated for dairy cows. The effects of feed additives include a shift in rumen pH, improved rumen fermentation, it modifies metabolic pathways, it leads to weight gain, it also leads to a reduction in methane production, and it improves energy and protein utilization. The use of ionophores in animal feed has been very successful in manipulating the rumen environment. However, the use of ionophores in animal feed has been banned in the European Union since 2006 and is facing increasing concerns from public health aspects and reduced social acceptance. So, are there other alternatives to ionophores? A possible substitution for ionophores is essential oils. Essential oils are volatile aromatic compounds, which improves health and production of lactating dairy cows. It also stimulates appetite and inhibits the growth of some gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. There is also no residues found in edible products. The aim of the study is to determine the effect of essential oils, namely eugenol, cinnamaldehyde, and thymol, on milk production, milk composition, and rumen environment of Jersey cows grazing ryegrass chicory pasture in the springtime. Materials and methods. The study was conducted during the late winter and early spring of 2019 at Outeniqua Research Farm, close to George in the Garden Route of South Africa. George has a mean rainfall of 731 mm per annum over the last 50 years and is known to have a temperate climate. The study took place over 67 days from 6 September to 12 October 2019. Production study. 2 treatment groups were used. used, the first being the essential oil treatment, which consisted of 12 grams essential oil per cow per day, the second one being the control treatment. 40 cows from the Outeniqua research farm were used, 20 cows per treatment. Cows were blocked according to mean milk yield of the previous 3 weeks, days in milk, and lactation number. Cows received 6 kilograms concentrate as is per day. 11.9 kgs of pasture were allocated to the cows daily. Pasture management. The pasture used in the current study was kikuyu oversown with Italian ryegrass. The paddock was fertilized with 28 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per grazing cycle. The cows strip grazed the pasture as one group. Pasture was allocated using a rising plate meter. Pasture readings was taken before and after each grazing, and water was available at all times. Sample collection. Daily milk production was recorded automatically with the Outeniqua milk meter and management system. Composite milk samples were collected every 2 weeks. The body condition score and the live weight of the cows were determined before the milking, both at the beginning and the end of the trial. Composite ryegrass samples were taken weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays before grazing. The concentrate was sampled respectively on Wednesday and pulled for every 2 weeks. All concentrate and pasture samples were dried at 60 degrees for 72 hours. Volatile fatty acid and ammonia nitrogen concentrations were determined by taking rumen liquor samples at 3 different times during the day. Rumen fluid was stained through 2 layers of cheesecloth and poured into marked airtight containers. Table 1 represents the ingredient composition of concentrates used in the study. The concentrate used in the study was a typical maize-based dairy concentrate. There wasn't much difference between the 2 treatments, except for the 2 kg per ton essential oil inclusion, which resulted in 12 grams essential oil intake per cow per day. Results and discussion. Table 2 represents the chemical composition of the concentrate and pasture used during the study. The dry matter percentage of the pasture was 17.3%, where those of the concentrates were 90%. The metabolizable energy of the concentrate were 12.5, where those of the pasture were 11.7. The crude protein percentage of the pasture were almost 17%, where those of the concentrate were 13%. Table 3 represents the pre- and post-grazing RPM meter readings, the pasture yield, the pasture allowance, and the pasture intake. The before grazing RPM reading was 22. The pasture yield was 1.5 tons dry matter per hectare. The allocated pasture was 12 kilograms per cow per day. The after grazing RPM reading was 10. The pasture yield was half a ton dry matter per hectare. The pasture intake was 8 kilograms dry matter per cow per day, and the pasture remove was 1 ton dry matter per hectare. Table 4 represents the mean milk yield and milk composition of cows receiving 2 different concentrates at 6 kilograms as is. There was no difference in milk yield, 4% fat-corrected milk and energy-corrected milk between the treatments. There were also no difference in fat percentage, protein percentage, and lactose percentage between treatments. Somatic cell count also didn't differ between treatments. Somatic cell count were below 150, which indicates good mastitis control. There was also no difference in MUN and BUN levels between the treatments. MUN levels were above 8, which indicates that protein was sufficient in the diet. Table 5 represents the mean body weight and body condition score change of cows receiving one of the two concentrate treatments. There was no difference between the control and essential oil treatment for live weight before, live weight after, and live weight changes. There was, however, a difference between the two treatments when it comes to body condition score before the study commenced. There was also no difference in body condition score after and body condition score change. The high body condition score for the essential oil group before the study commenced could explain the low body condition score change during the duration of the study. Figure 1 represents the rumen pH profile over a 24-hour period. In Figure 1, it can be seen that the rumen pH for the two treatments had a similar pattern and no differences in rumen pH were recorded. A drop in the pH were recorded after the cows received 3 kg of concentrate in the milking parlor at 6 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon. The decline in pH post-feeding is due to readily fermentable carbohydrates present in the concentrate treatment. The highest pH value for both treatments were recorded at 5 in the morning, just before morning milk. Table 6 represents the total volatile fatty acid and ammonia and nitrogen concentration and average pH of the two treatment groups. There was no difference in volatile fatty acid between the control and essential oil treatment. There was also no difference in ammonia and nitrogen concentration between the two treatments. As seen before, the average pH of the two treatments also didn't differ. The rumen ammonia nitrogen concentration falls within the suggested range of 8.7 to 32 milligrams per deciliter. This suggests that the nitrogen from the pasture was effectively utilized in the rumen. To conclude, in the current study, feeding a mixture of essential oils did not affect the milk production, the milk composition, the rumen pH, the volatile fatty acid concentrations, and the rumen ammonia nitrogen concentrations. Thank you so much for your time and for this great opportunity.
We are here today at the Outeniqua Agricultural Research Farm. It is a great day here in George. My strategic priorities include research, education and development, as well as market access. I'm here at the Outeniqua Dairy, and it is my privilege and an honor to introduce our colleague here. He's responsible for this dairy farm. Tell us about the significance and the importance of research on this farm.
Yeah, the dairy industry is a major industry in our area, and it's grown a lot over the years as milk production has moved towards the coastal strip. And this farm has also grown with that. And at this stage, we're milking 360 cows. So it's a nice commercial-based research facility. And you would realize that if you have to milk so many cows, you need good facility to do that. Yeah, so last year, the building at the dairy parlor was renovated, and they literally lifted the roof and took the old roof off. And it enabled us to change the system quite dramatically with a dual feed system. So now we are able to feed two different types of concentrates to larger number of cows. And that's quite valuable because in the past we had to weigh feed off by hand and lift the baling and only put 20 cows in one side. So we can actually upscale our research effort. And then also we changed the dairy machine also. And it's got quite a few very remarkable features. The one is the OffiLab system, where we are able to measure milk fat, milk protein, and lactose. It also measures conductivity, so we can quickly pick up if a cow has got mastitis. And milk is recorded every day. It goes onto the computer. And with the dual feeding system, now we are able to feed different levels of feed and different feeds. So we are very happy with all the changes that occurred. Previously, the roof was low; it was very hot inside, and now it's a totally different setup. and we are ready for the next 10 to 20 years with this dairy.
Great air circulation, and also did your milk production increase?
The milk production didn't increase that much because the previous system was efficient, but we all the time had people wanting to put air cons in and so on, and it's, in a dairy parlor you want natural airflow, which is much better. And yeah, so it's very efficient. Our dairy is operating very well. The milk production is between 15 and 16 liters. Here in October we go up to 20 liters. We feed about 5-6 kilograms of concentrate per cow. But what's nice is it's a very complicated system. So the cow enters the dairy, the cow is ID'd by the system, and then receives whatever concentrate to whatever amount we want to feed.
Now, since this is a commercial dairy, what is your relationship with the market access?
Yeah, our milk goes to Nestle at this stage, and yeah, we're very closely linked to dairy farmers and belong to a study group. So we really know what's going out there, and I think it's so important because if you want to do useful research, you must be on the ground with your feet in the mud, and you must know what's going on.
And I see that you've recently also assisted the milk producing organization as part of your humanitarian relief, as part of COVID-19 relief. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, for us it was a privilege to be involved with that, and together with an NGO we managed to distribute quite a lot of milk powder from Nestle. Nestle was the other partner, and in total the total donation is a bit more than 100,000 Rand of value, and this was then donated to an NGO in the area that works with children and being able to feed or supply milk powder to children for quite a long time.
Yes, this is the Outeniqua Research Farm, a world-class dairy facility based on research, capacity, evidence-based science that is happening here, collecting data on every day, transform that data into information, back into the industry, supporting farmers to make choices, particularly as it relates to their agriculture. This is really what agriculture is all about. And so we are particularly pleased that we still value evidence-based practice, research and development to make a productive contribution to the agricultural performance here in the Western Cape. And I'm so pleased that during COVID-19, that this dairy farm belonging to the Western Cape Department of Agriculture right here in George could assist the community during the COVID-19 relief efforts. Signing off for the love of agriculture. We are here today at the Outeniqua Research Farm in George, and with me is the Mayor of George Municipality. Agriculture is very significant in this region. Meyer, tell us more about the strategic role of agriculture in George.
Yes, thank you, Minister. Agriculture is of vital importance in the George area. It's a major sector, and within agriculture, we find that the dairy, the milk, the cheese production is of enormous value, along with vegetable farming, along with the berries and various other fruits as well. So it plays a major role in terms of the number of the employment that we provide, and as well in terms of that value that gets added into the economy. So the municipality wishes to play a very important role in trying to enable and to facilitate the further advancement of agriculture and growth in both production and in employment. So it is vital as we move into the whole economic recovery phase post-COVID-19.
That's the Mayor of George Municipality outlining the importance of agriculture and agro-processing, particularly as it relates to job creation, economic growth, and economic recovery right here in George. Signing off for the love of agriculture.
Welcome to Outeniqua's dairy parlor. Now, this dairy parlor has been around for quite a while, but we've done quite a few interesting upgrades recently. This is a 20-point swing over, a dairy parlor, so we can milk 20 cows at a side, and the arm swings over. Changes that we have made we included the Outeniqua system, which has got milk meters. You can see the milk meters over there. And then another feature is the Outeniqua Lab. The Outeniqua Lab enables us to have data on milk fat, milk protein and lactose on a daily basis. So it's a lot of extra information that we can add. Also, the milk meters, a very important part of the system. For a dairy parlor like this to function properly, you need to have good ID. So that's a crucial part of the system, and the IDing is working quite well. Previously, before we had, in the old dairy, we had a lot of interference with the IDing, which is now sorted out with the new system, and also with the major changes. We literally lifted the roof, so the old roof came off, and the walls were built up. And another big change now is the dual feeding system, where we were able now to put 2 feed bins on each side, which enables us to feed 2 different types of feed at any different amount that we decide. So this will enable us to do larger scale trials with more cows, where we've got 2 concentrate treatments. Another feature of this parlor is this baling system. This is now the Dairy Master baling system. When you do have a swing over dairy, it's always a challenge to keep the cows at the right angle. And with this baling system, it actually forces the cows to a specific angle. So the cows are always aligned with the clusters. And the other very nice thing about it is a cow cannot enter anywhere in the dairy. So the first cow has to enter here in the front one and pushes it open for the next cow, and so it continues. So you'll see when the cows enter the dairy parlor, there's a system that works very well. And then after cows are finished milking, the whole baling lifts up and the cows walk out. So previously we had to weigh off, if we do a trial, we had to weigh off that feed in bags. We have to lift the baling, put the feed in by hand, separate the cows. So it was a major limitation. So with this new system, we will be able to do larger scale trials for longer periods with more cows. So we're very happy about that. Another big advantage in the dairy parlor is the ventilation. Very important, all the vents that we put on at the top to be able that the hot air can escape out of this building. Because you can realize that if you've got 40 cows in here, they emit a lot of heat. And that was a major constraint with the previous parlor where the roof was low and the heat, we couldn't get rid of the heat, became very hot in here. So yeah, we're looking forward for the next couple of years to do good research with this dairy parlor. To get rid of dung in a dairy parlor is quite an issue, and for that we installed this furrow here. So it's a PVC pipe with 2 angle irons fitted into it. So all the dung can be sprayed directly into that and is out of our way. This is quite important because you see in some dairies people really struggle with the dung. They have to spray it on and spray it for a long distance. So here it's immediately gone. So it's a very handy thing to have in a dairy parlor. This dairy parlor was designed to enable basically 2 people to milk 400 cows. And to make it easy, all the controls are from inside the dairy. So here's a lever with which I can open for cows to enter, and also then of course close again when cows are inside. The baling is basically lifted from this lever here at the bottom. So when you lift the baling, this will happen. So when cows are already milked, then the baling would drop again. Okay, outside of the dairy, we've got our scale that cows will walk over. And it's a very functional system where cows walk over the scale and we can weigh them twice a day after each milking. And just behind the scale is the drafting gate, which enables us to draft cows in 3 different directions. That's also very valuable if we do trials, because then we can easily separate the different groups. Also, if you have to sort cows that need to be AI'd or need some medical attention, it's very easy to do.